Hello, guys. Reading some more Sleepy Hollow. Wish me luck. Hopefully, y'all finish it. We only have 50 pages left. Okay? If I lock in, it could only take an hour. An hour. That's all. Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend. And considering all things, a stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mix of pliability and perseverance in his nature. He was in form and spirit like a supplejack, yielding but tough. Though he bent, he never broke, and though he bowed beneath the slightest pressure, yet the moment it was away, jerk. He was as erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his armors, any more than that story lover Achilles. Ichabod therefore made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he had made frequent visits at the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Bob Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better even than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything. His notable little wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves. Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house or plied her spinning wheel, one in the piazza, honest Balt would sit smoking his evening pipe with the other, watching the achievements of a little wooden warrior, who, armed with a sword in each hand, is most valiantly fighting the wind of the pinnacle of the barn. In the meantime, Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of spring under the great elm, a-sauntering along in the twilight, that hour so favourable to the lover's eloquence. Profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have but one vulnerable part or doors of access, while others have a thousand avenues, and may be captured in 1,000 different ways. It is a great triumph of skill to gain the former, but a still greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter. For the man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. Certain it is that this was not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones, and from the moment Ichabod Crane made his advances, the interest of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied at the palings on Sunday nights, and a deadly feud gradually arose between him and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would fain have carried matters to open warfare, and have settled their pretensions to the lady according to the mode of those most concise and simple reasoners, the knight-errant of yore, by a single combat. But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones that he would double the schoolmaster up, and lay him on a shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too wary to give him the opportunity.
Word for you.
There was something extremely provoking in this obstinately pacific system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of a rustic waggery in his disposition, and to play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival. Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution of Bones and his gang of rough riders. They harried his hitherto peaceful domains, smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, broke into the schoolhouse at night, in spite of its formidable fastenings of brass and window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor schoolmaster began to think all the witches in the country held their matings there. But what was still more annoying, Brom took opportunities of turning him into ridicule in presence of his mistress, and a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous manner, introduced as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way matters went on for some time, without producing any material effect on the relative situation of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, Ichabod, in pensive mood, sat enthroned on the lofty stool whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little literary realm. In his hand he swayed for rule, a sceptre of despotic power. The birch of justice reposed on 3 nails. Behind the throne, a constant terror to evildoers, while on the desk before him might be seen sundry contraband articles and prohibited weapons, detected upon the persons of idle urchins, such as half-munched apples, pop-guns, whirligigs, fly-cages, and a whole legion of rampant little paper game chickens. They make the birds. Apparently there have been some appalling acts of justice recently inflicted, for high scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them with one eye kept upon the master, and a kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. It was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a person in tow-cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat like the cap of Mercury, and mounted on the back of a ragged, wild, half-grown colt, which he managed with the rope by the way of halter. Came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merry-making or quilting frolic to be held that evening at Minor Von Tassel's, and having delivered his message with the air of importance and effort at fine language which servant is apt to display on petty embassies of the kind, he dashed over the brook and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and hurry of his mission. All was now hustle and hubbub in the late quiet school. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, and those who were tardy had a smart application now and then in the rear to quicken their speed or help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves, inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, the whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time, bursting forth like a legion of young imps, yelping and racketing about the green, and jolly at their early emancipation. The gallant Ichabod now spent at least an extra half-hour at his toilet, brushing and furbishing up his vest in indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a bit of broken-looking glass that hung up in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was domiciliated, a choleric old Dutchman of the name of Hans von Ripper, and thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight-errant in quest of adventures. But it is meet I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks and equipment of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough-horse that had outlived almost everything but his viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with an ewe neck and a head like him. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye had lost a pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Genuine. Still, he must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of gunpowder. He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master's, the choleric Von Ripper, who was a furious rider and had infused very probably some of his own spirit into the animal. Old and broken down as he looked, there was more of the lurking devil in him than in any young filly in the country. Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of his saddle. His sharp elbows stuck out like grasshoppers. He carried his whip perpendicularly in his hand like a sceptre, and as his horse jogged on, the motion of his arm was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings. A small wood hat rested on the top of his nose, for so his scanty strip of forehead might be called on, and the skirts of his black cloak fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gate of Hans von Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom to be met with in broad daylight. It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and gold livery which we always associate with the idea of abundance. Forests had put on their silver brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frost into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet. Streaming files of wild ducks began to make their appearance high in the air. The bark of the squirrel might be heard from the groves of beech and hickory nuts, the pensive whistle of the quail at intervals from the neighboring stubble field. The small birds were taking their farewell banquets in the fullness of their revelry. They fluttered, chirping and frolicking, from bush to bush and tree to tree, capricious from the very profession and variety around them. There was the honest cock-robin, the favorite game of stripling sportsmen, with its loud, querulous notes, and the twittering blackbirds flying in sable clouds, and the golden-winged woodpecker with its crimson chest, his broad black gorget and splendid plumage, and the cedar bird with its red-tipped wings and yellow-tipped tail, and its little Monterio cap of feathers, and the blue jay, that noisy coxcomb, in his gay light blue coat and white underclothes, screaming and chattering, nodding and bobbing and bowing, and pretending to be on good terms with every songster of the grove. As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast store of apple, some hanging in the oppressive opulence of the trees, opulence on the trees, some gathered into basket and barrels for the market, others heaped up in rich piles for the cedar press. Farther on he beheld great fields of Indian corn, with its golden ears peeping from their leafy coverlets, holding out the promise of cakes and hasty pudding, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, turning up their fair round bellies to the sun, and giving ample prospects of the most luxurious supplies. And anon he passed the frequent buckwheat fields, breathing the odour of the beehive, and as he beheld them, soft anticipations stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered and garnished with honey or treacle, by the delicate little dimpled hands of Katrina von Tassel. Thus feeding his mind with many sweet thoughts and sugared suppositions, he journeyed along the sides of a range of hills which looked out upon some of the goodliest scenes of the mighty Hudson. The sun gradually wheeled his broad disk down to the west. The wide bosom of the Tappan Zee lay motionless and glassy, excepting that here and there was a gentle undulation waved and prolonged the blue shadows of the distant mountain. A few amber clouds floated in the sky without a breath of air to move them. The horizon was of fine golden tint, shading gradually into a pure apple green, and from that into the deep blue of the mid-heaven. A slanting ray lingered on the woody crest of the precipice that overhung some parts of the river, giving greater depth to the dark gray and purple of their rocky sides. The slope was loitering in the distance, dropping slowly down with the tide, her sail hanging uselessly against the map. And as the reflection of the sky gleamed along the still water, it seemed as if the vessel was suspended in the air. It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Herr von Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flowers of the adjacent country. Old farmers with spare leathern-faced rays and homespun coats and breeches, blue stockings, huge shoes, and magnificent pewter buckles, had brisk withered little dames in close-crimped caps, long-waisted short gowns, homespun petticoats with scissors and pincushions, and gay calico pockets hanging on the outside. Buxom lasses, almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a straw hat, a fine ribbon, or perhaps a white frock, gave symptoms of city innovation. The sons in short square-skirted coats with a row of stupendous brass buttons, and their hair generally queued in the fashion of the times, especially if they could procure an eelskin for the purpose, it being esteemed throughout the country as a potent nourisher and strengthener of the hair. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favourite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief which no one but himself could manage. He was in fact noted for preferring vicious animals, given to all kinds of tricks which kept the rider in constant risk of his neck, for he held a tractable, well-broken horse as unworthy of a lad of spirit. That is all for now. We are on page 70, which leaves us 30 more, I believe, chapters to go. 30 to 40 more pages to go, not chapters. Hopefully I'll get them done this week, because I really got to consent, okay? I didn't even have the microphone. I hope you guys heard that. You probably didn't. Whatever. Bye, y'all. That's like